Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome into this week's edition of my top starts and sits for week 5 of the fantasy football season. We are officially in that bye period, so you guys might be looking for some streaming options. So I think I do have a couple names on here that you might be able to pluck off the waivers. More specifically, at the quarterback and tight end spot, the wide receivers and running backs I'll be speaking about today. I would assume that they're on most rosters across most fantasy leagues. But these are also names I always say too, like when you put together your daily fantasy lineups, these are names that you can consider as well. But yeah, let's go ahead and dive into it. As always, starting with the quarterback position, and my top start at the quarterback position this week. He plays tomorrow night, so I picked him up, and I'm gonna be playing him for Justin Herbert this week. Sam Howell against the Bears. He's got a great matchup on paper. The Bears are allowing the second most points per game to quarterbacks this season, allowing 21.6 points per game. And then when you look what they've allowed in the first 4 games, there's been 3 out of the 4 games where a quarterback has thrown for at least, I think it's been 3 touchdowns even. Maybe there was one guy that threw for 4 touchdowns, but there's 3 out of 4 games where a quarterback has thrown at least 3 touchdowns against that Bears defense. And then what even makes this more of a juicier matchup for Sam Howell this week is today. Their cornerback Jalen Johnson and their safety Eddie Jackson both have been ruled out because of injuries. So they're going to be missing. It was already a struggling defense, a struggling secondary, and their secondary is now going to be without their best 2 defenders in the back end of the defense. So this sets up well with Sam Howell. I think he can take advantage of it, and he can have you a more of a ceiling game out of him going forward. And then my other start, I am going to go with the Monday night matchup. I'm going to go with Jordan Love against the Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders are allowing 20.2 points per game to quarterbacks this year so far. That is the 7th most across the NFL. And then when you looked at what they've allowed in the first 4 weeks, they've allowed 8 passing touchdowns by quarterbacks in 4 games. So that's an average of 2 touchdowns a game. I think I really like that. And then you got to factor in that this will be Christian Watson's second game back from injury. He should be even more acclimated. They've had plenty of time since that Thursday night game last week. So that should get Aaron Jones a lot healthier, where he should be more involved in the offense. And we know all it takes is a little dump off to Aaron Jones. All of a sudden, you got a easy 40-yard screen touchdown for Jordan Love. So yeah, those are 2 names where if you're like me, where I have Justin Herbert on a bye week and you're looking for an option, maybe you didn't get the guy off the waivers last night that you wanted. I know I was trying to get CJ Stroud in the league for him, but unfortunately I missed out on him. I went up and picked up Sam Howell, but if I wouldn't have got Howell, I would have looked for Love as well. My sits. I'm going to go with Trevor Lawrence against the Bills. The Bills right now, they've only allowed 7.6 points per game to quarterbacks this year. That is the fewest amount. There's only been one quarterback to throw for over 200 passing yards against this defense, and that was Tua this past weekend. And then as far as production, as far as scoring, they've only given up 3 touchdowns to quarterbacks, passing touchdowns in the first 4 games, and they have 8 interceptions in the first 4 games. So it's one of the better defenses in the NFL. We just saw what they did to that Miami Dolphins defense. So I wouldn't be surprised if they continue that success against the Jaguars in London on Sunday morning. My other top sit, I'm going to go with Jared Goff against the Panthers. Now, obviously, people look at that Panthers record. They're 0-4. They must be struggling. More on their offensive side. They have a very solid defense there in Carolina. And then in terms of fantasy, though, they're only giving up 11.8 points per game to quarterbacks this year. That is the 6th fewest across the league. And then when you look at the first 4 games, only one quarterback threw for over 230 yards. That was Geno Smith. And then as far as like touchdowns and interceptions, they've only given up 4 passing touchdowns to quarterbacks in the first 4 games, and they've picked off quarterbacks 4 times. So only averaging 1 touchdown a game. So yeah, the Panthers have been proven so far that they've been able to keep quarterbacks in check in terms of fantasy. So if you're thinking about playing a Jared Goff, I would definitely look maybe for a Sam Howell or a Jordan Love. Moving into my top starts and sits at the running back position. Think we got the game, guys. I think we're going to see Breece Hall completely blow up. I got Dalvin Cook listed here against the Broncos. I like Breece Hall a lot more for the season leagues just because of the news that came out today. Robert Saleh says they're no longer going to limit the amount of the workload that Hall is going to get. So I think he's going to potentially blow up. We already saw what he was doing in limited touches in the first 4 weeks, and I think Dalvin Cook could definitely be a cheap play for your running back spot in daily lineups this weekend. But with that being said, looking at this matchup, going against that Broncos defense where they're giving up 38 points per game to the running back position, plenty of points they've been giving up to running backs to go around between Hall and Cook on Sunday. And then as far as the last 3 games, over the last 3 games, they've given up 7 rushing touchdowns. So yeah, I think Hall's going to blow up this weekend. I wouldn't be surprised if Cook does his fair share of work as well. My other top start, I'm going to go with Joe Mixon against the Cardinals. Obviously, this Bengals offense has been a mess, but I think the one way they can maybe help Joe Burrow as he's getting healthier is get this running game going, right? Because then they can feed off the play action, and that can help out Burrow and that passing attack to try to get back on sync. So I kind of think we're going to see more of them more lean into a rushing attack against this Arizona Cardinals defense, where teams have been finding success. Now, in terms of fantasy, the Cardinals are allowing 26.1 points per game to running backs so far this season. That's the 3rd most allowed across the league. And then as far as looking at the first 4 games, they've given up 6 rushing touchdowns. Mixon hasn't done this much this year. He's kind of due for one of those classic Mixon ceiling games. I think this is the matchup he's going to get it done. My top sits, I am going to go with the Rams running back, Kyren. It's Kyren Williams. I've been saying Kyren this whole time, but when I was watching the Colts-Rams game, the announcer called him Kyren Williams, so I think that's how you say it, unless the play-by-play guy was totally butchering his name. Eventually, hopefully I'll get it down, but I'm going to go like Kyren Williams, since that's how I heard it this past Sunday. With that being said, stop talking about his name. Let's talk about fantasy football. Going against the Eagles defense, obviously we all know about the Eagles defensive front and how great it is, but when you look at what's going on in fantasy, they're only giving up 8 points a game to running backs, and that's the fewest amount in the NFL. Before this past Sunday, they allowed 0 rushing touchdowns. They have now allowed 2 rushing touchdowns, but one of those rushing touchdowns were to Sam Howell this past Sunday. And then the most yards by a single running back they have allowed is 45 yards. So they have yet to allow one running back to go over 50 yards. They've only allowed 1 rushing touchdown by a running back in the first 4 games. So if you have Williams, I think this is a week that you're going to want to leave him on the sidelines. My other sit, he just had his best game so far this season, but I would definitely consider putting him right back to the bench based on this matchup. But I'm going with Dameon Pierce against the Falcons. The Falcons are allowing 10.2 points per game to running back so far this year. That is the 4th fewest across the NFL. And then when you look at what's going on as far as like the breakdown production, the most yards a single back has gotten against Atlanta has been 80 yards. And they have only allowed 1 rushing touchdown in the first 4 games. And that rushing touchdown was a quarterback sneak to Jared Goff. So yeah, they've limited the production at the running back spot so far through the first month of the NFL season. So as much as you might see Dameon Pierce, you know, he just came off his best game. They're getting Titus Howard and not Titus. I was about to say Ronnie Stanley. Laramie Tunsil. I mixed the left tackles up. Laramie Tunsil and Titus Howard back in that Texans offensive line. You think you would set up right, but when you look at this matchup on paper, it gives you a reason why you may want to consider other options than Dameon Pierce this weekend. Moving into my top starts and sits for the wide receiver position. My top start of the week, I'm going with Zay Flowers against the Steelers. Now, I don't have Odell Beckham Jr. listed there or Rashad Bateman, but those 2 did return to practice today. So they could maybe both be a sneaky play, especially in the daily lineups, because you could probably get either of those guys at a pretty cheap rate in your daily lineup. So that's something to consider. But I'm all about Zay Flowers. I think we're going to see him really blow up this week. Going against that Steelers defense, who are allowing 31.3 points per game to the wide receiver position in fantasy this year. That's the 2nd most allowed. And then as far as looking at what they have allowed in the first 4 games, They have allowed 3 players to go over 100 receiving yards, and they have allowed 8 wide receiver touchdowns in the first 4 games. So, giving up tons of production to the wide receiver position. Flowers has been getting peppered with all these little catches, not really a lot of yardage in production. I think this is the week we see him go over 100 yards and maybe get you a touchdown or 2 on Sunday. My other start, I'm going with Garrett Wilson and Allen Lazard against the Broncos. I think this is a great spot for the Jets offensive players this weekend. And I can't believe I got to list Garrett Wilson, because when I entered the season, I thought he's going to be one of the players I shouldn't have to tell you to start. But obviously with Zach Wilson, it's kind of been like, can I trust this situation? Obviously we saw what Zach did in that brief stint, but regardless of how Zach looked, I think I would have liked this matchup for Garrett Wilson and Allen Lazard regardless. When you look at the matchup in terms of the production and everything, Denver's defense is allowing 28.8 points per game to wide receivers this year. That's the 7th most allowed. And then they have allowed 2 receivers to go over 100 yards in the first 4 games. And then this is what really I like about it. They have given up 10 wide receiver touchdowns in the first 4 games. So giving up the yards, giving up the touchdown. So I think this is not only a spot where you're going to see Garrett Wilson get to his normal, at least his floor and his big ceiling. I think this is also a sneaky week for Allen Lazard to be in some daily lineups as well. Moving into my top sits, I am going to go with Drake London against the Texans defense. Now, the Texans defense played really great over the last 2 weeks, but then when you look at what they've allowed in the first 4 games, they have allowed the second fewest amount of points per game to wide receivers, only 13.6 points per game. There has been no wide receivers that go over the 100 receiving mark against the Texans this year, and in the first 4 games there's only been 1 wide receiver touchdown allowed. So they have been very good at keeping these wide receivers in check in terms of fantasy. And obviously there's the quarterback issue with Desmond Ridder in Atlanta. I don't, at this point, especially with Kyle Pitts and all that stuff, it's like unless it's Bijan, you can't really trust anybody else in Atlanta's offense right now for fantasy. And the matchup says you probably shouldn't play him. So if you got a better option than Drake London, I would consider it. My last top sits, I'm going to go with Jerry Jeudy and Courtland Sutton against that Jets defense. Obviously, you got Sauce Gardner for the Jets defense. He's going to be lining up on both of these guys throughout the game. He's going to be able to lock them down. But when you look at what the Jets have allowed this season, it's a third. They've only allowed the 3rd fewest allowed points per game to wide receivers, and then they've only allowed 2 receivers to go over 100 receiving yards. And guess what? Those were special wide receivers: Stephon Diggs and CeeDee Lamb. I don't think we all know this, Jerry Jeudy and Courtland Sutton are not in their level of tier of wide receivers. So those are elite wide receivers that were able to get over the 100-yard receiving mark against the Jets. And then they also have only allowed 1 wide receiver touchdown in the first 4 games. So I think this Jets defense is going to be able to, they're going to be motivated, right? This is the whole Sean Payton made these comments about the Jets this offseason. So it's going to be a little feistiness, I think, out of this Jets defense as well. So yeah, if you're thinking about playing Jeudy or Sutton this week, I think this is going to be the one that you would want to avoid them. Moving into my top starts and sits for the tight end position. My top start, I'm going to go with Tyler Higbee against the Eagles. I know it sounds like Cooper Kupp may return this week, but I think that's actually a benefit for Tyler Higbee because of the emergence of Puka Nacua. Tutu Atwell has been doing good things. There's going to obviously be more eyes on the secondary with Kupp on there, so that should allow a lot of one-on-one type of opportunities for Tyler Higbee. And he's going against the Eagles defense where the linebackers are not great in coverage. So that kind of makes sense too, with them not having great coverage linebackers in Philadelphia, of why they've allowed all these points. So they're giving up 10.4 points per game to tight ends this year. That's tied for the 2nd most allowed. And then through the first 4 games, tight ends have combined for 234 receiving yards, and they have allowed 3 tight end touchdowns in the first 4 games. So sometimes that's all you want in fantasy, right? Your tight end just to score you a touchdown. So they've been giving up the yards. They've been giving up touchdowns to the position. So I think Tyler Higbee sets up for a great play this week. My other start, I talked to him about him last night in my waiver wire video. I'm going to go ahead and continue it into tonight. Zach Ertz against the Bengals. He is I probably did my waiver wire speech. But anyways, going against the Bengals defense, as far as what the Bengals are allowing, they're giving up 10 points per game to tight ends so far this year. That is the third most allowed, which is kind of surprising. They got Logan Wilson, who's one of the better coverage linebackers in the NFL, but I think that whole team is struggling, right? But then when you look at the breakdown production, they've given up 220 receiving yards, combined receiving yards to all the tight ends they faced this year, and then they have also allowed 3 tight end touchdowns in the first 4 games. So giving up the yards, giving up the touchdowns to the position, and like I keep on saying, sometimes all you want is a touchdown. And then Ertz has been getting fed the ball. If you haven't heard my reason why you can consider him picking up off the waivers, go watch the video I posted last night. I don't want to rehash all that to people that have already listened to that video. My top sits, this comes for tomorrow night's game. Cole Kmet against the Commanders. Very surprisingly, I don't. They got Jermaine Davis there as linebackers. It's like I didn't really think they would be that great against the tight end position, but when you look at what they've done, the Commanders' defense have kept the tight ends in check in the first 4 games. In fantasy, they're only giving up 2.1 points per game, the tight ends. They've only combined between all the tight ends they've faced. Tight ends have only combined for 80 receiving yards against this defense, and they have allowed 0 touchdowns to tight ends as well. So yeah, if you're thinking about streaming Cole Kmet, I know he just had one of his better games of the season this past Sunday. I think I would definitely go consider a Zach Ertz or a Tyler Higbee over him. The other sit, it's going to be Evan Ingram against the Bills. Now, Evan Ingram has been actually one of the 2 consistent fantasy tight ends this season, so it could be tough to sit him. So maybe you would want to temper your expectations if you have Evan Ingram in your lineup. But with that being said, he's got a rough matchup. They're going against that Bills defense who has Matt Milano, and you can debate between him and Fred Warner. They're the top 2 coverage linebacker in the NFL. And then when you look at the fantasy aspect, they're only giving up 2.8 points per game to tight ends. That's the 3rd fewest across the league. And as far as all the tight ends they've faced in 4 games, they've only given up 112 receiving yards. And just like the Commanders, there is yet to be a tight end to score a touchdown against the Bills defense. So it's a really great defense. I already said to sit there, really good quarterback. So yeah, if you do play a Evan Ingram this week, I understand he's been one of the more consistent tight ends through the first 4 games, but I would just temper your expectations. But when you put those daily lineups together, or you put together a special lineup for that London game, maybe consider leaving Evan Ingram out of it. So yeah, that is my video for this week, week 5. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, hit the like button. If you have not subscribed to my channel or followed me on all my social media platforms, make sure you do follow me. As always, if you have any questions about players I did not speak about in this video, feel free to get in the comments section, or you can slide into a DM and I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. Other than that, I'm going to head out of here. You guys will see me next Tuesday night with the waiver wire and streaming defense video. I'll talk to you then. Peace out.